Our speaker today, Mr. Chesnutt, is from the Army Corps of Engineers. And I thought it'd be interesting to remind everybody that this famous gentleman in our state of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, is the one who, you know, lived in France for a long time, and Paris, and he knew all about the École Militaire. So he started in 1802 a permanent Corps of Engineers. And the concept is a body of engineers for military and civilian missions. And he established the first military academy at West Point. Working for the Corps, they're really civilians, they're not in the military. The Chief of Engineers, however, is a military general stationed in Washington, D.C. And these Corps of Engineers works are on both civil works programs and for the Department of Defense. So our federal government view, you remember last 2 weeks ago, whenever I was trying to give the academic view. But today we're going to hear from one of the agencies in the federal government. The Corps is the leading federal government agency dealing with coastal matters. They also will play a prominent role in how the federal government shapes policy regarding sea level rise. And anybody leading our adaptation efforts. And finally, the Corps is developing strategies to mitigate and adapt the flooding coastal regions expected from sea level rise, because that's the theme of this seminar series. And I'll introduce Charlie properly now. He's a graduate of Texas A&M back quite a few years ago when I first met Charlie. So we go way back. He did laboratory work in CERC in Fort Belvoir early on in his career. Then even a long time, many years he was in planning and engineering construction divisions at headquarters, or what I call the chief of the Army Corps of Engineers in Washington, D.C. And in 2004, he moved over to Fort Belvoir and now is the chief coastal engineer for the Institute for Water Resources, an organization within the Corps of Engineers. Charlie has been very active in his career in floodplain management and associated with both FEMA and NOAA, of course, and how the Corps of Engineers coordinates their activities. He studied evacuation planning in the Pacific and Caribbean for big storms. He's the manager presently of the National Shoreline Management Program. He's working with NOAA, FEMA, and non-commissioned government officers and universities to take a systems approach to, I like that word, geomorphic engineering, which he's dubbed SAGE, for sustainable landscape transformations and ecosystem adaptation. And he's been sort of the coastal and sea level rise spokesperson for the Corps for a long time. So, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Charlie Chesnutt.
Thank you, Dave. It has been a long time. I was already a graduate student at A&M when Dave showed up as a young buck professor, and I had the privilege of being in one of his first classes, maybe not the first, but anyway. And we've just bumped into each other off and on over the years, and it's really refreshing to maintain that kind of a relationship with a former professor. And I want to thank you for the invitation. It's given me a reason to stop and think. And let me just explain a little bit about the Institute for Water Resources. We're a think tank off to the side of Corps headquarters. We're not involved in day-to-day mission work that the districts or the divisions carry out. But we look at things in a big picture, futuristically, try and anticipate what the Corps is going to need to be preparing for, and then advise the Chief of Engineers, the Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations, and his Director of Civil Works. But we're available to advise a lot of other people within Washington, and we just relish the opportunity to go and explain to people on the Hill, within the administration, within the White House, very technical things, but at a level that is related to the politics of the decisions that they're making. So it's a nice combination of looking at technical matters, but relating it to our political decision makers. And the opportunity for me is I'm running in 15 directions all the time, and Dave listed some of the things that I'm working on, and those are the big things that I'm working on, but there's always something new. But I rarely get the opportunity to stop and think about, well, how does this all mesh together? And this, having to come here and think about how I would talk about just the subject of sea level rise was useful to me, and I appreciate this opportunity. And what you're going to find, though, is you're going to get to see a picture of my brain at work in this conversation here, and it's just a lot of stuff flows together. I do have an outline for a speech, but we'll see where we go as we get into this. Let me just jump in quickly and then say about sea level rise. So we start out on target anyway, and that is that the Corps has been very much concerned about this and involved in this since way before 1982. And we've always had, well, at least in recent years, guidance about how to deal with sea level rise. And it's very important to the planning and design of our projects that we incorporate that. But beginning with in 1982, the whole subject got ramped up within the federal government, and we have been working with EPA and others ever since then. And in that vein, in the mid-'80s, we went to the National Research Council and said, okay, we're hearing all this stuff from EPA and from NOAA, but what does it mean to us as engineers? And what are the engineering implications of this subject? And we were the principal funders of an NRC study to look at what are the engineering implications. Bob Dean led that effort, and we're still using that guidance. And that's really important. We listen to the academic community. We tend to focus, let NRC pull things together for us and put it into a nice size document that we can take and run with, but then we run with it. And what did Bob Dean say in there, along with the rest of the committee? That sea level rise is accelerating. We can't say how much it's going to accelerate, but they gave us 3 different curves of what it might be: a low rate, a medium rate, and a high rate. But they also said, but we have the engineering technology to respond to any of this, and we have the time frame in which to develop engineering solutions to anything that might come along. Short of a catastrophic rise for whatever reason, anything else we can accommodate that engineers can handle it. And so we've taken this very reasoned, confident approach that we can deal with whatever comes at us. Now, there are other people within the business who say, well, we got to do more right now. We got to do more right now. Well, let me, not to throw the blame on somebody else, but the economists are not going to let us go there, okay? Okay, and why not? Because the way we make economic decisions in this country and this is as established by Congress over several Congresses of different political bents, that we're going to give more emphasis to the near-term investments and benefits than we are to the long-term. We'll calculate the long-term, but when you take a future benefit and bring it back to today's value, it kind of goes away. So you better, if you're going to justify a project, you better have a benefit that's going to accrue within the next 10 to 20 years, because that will justify a project. Now, should we be looking longer term? Yeah, but that's not our decision, okay? That's Congress has got to make a different set of decisions if we want to do something different there. And we'll come back to Congress before we're done. Every few years we update our planning guidance, and then we've begun improving the engineering guidance for designs as we capture more of the results from various studies. But we look closely at the IPCC reports. Of note, though, is that if you look at curves 1, 2, and 3 in both the IPCC 4 and 5 reports, they still track very, very closely with the 3 curves in the NRC report. And so since we've developed an equation that characterizes each of the 3 curves in there, it's just easy to keep using those. Because in fact, if you include the uncertainty around any one of the 3 curves, it incorporates everything anyway. And that raises a subject that just to throw out to the academic community. We spend a lot of time within the Corps of Engineers talking about risk and uncertainty, and we have invested heavily in the rhetoric of risk reduction communication. What we need you folks to help us on is the uncertainty. It isn't enough to just say, well, this is what the risk is, and this is what the uncertainty of the value is, okay, and we'll look at it in 50 years when we need to update this project. Now, we need to be managing the uncertainty, okay? We talk about managing the risk, but we really need you folks to help us manage uncertainty, okay? We've got to be reducing the uncertainty. We're probably not going to change the risk very much, but we've got to change the uncertainty. And that really requires investment in data collection. And I'm going to offend my friends within the modeling community, but models are good. They inform a lot of things. But when you get ready to make a strong economic statement, they want hard numbers of not just what does the model say, but what does the data say, okay? We need investment in the IU system. Go for it, Larry. And to kind of leap ahead to the end of the conversation, we've got to look seriously at how are we financing the integrated ocean observing system, because guess what? The federal government is not the solution to growing the $300 million program that we collectively put together. If NOAA gets to keep the $30 million that they invest in it, and if we get to keep the $1 million or $2 million that we put into waves, that will be success, okay? There's no way either NOAA or we are going to build the $300 million network of ocean observing systems that's absolutely needed, okay? And the only thing I can offer you is if I can go help somebody understand why they need to invest in what you're doing, let me know, because I will do that. I will make that visit. And this kind of leads into the next thing. We're going to need you more and more in the academic community as we move ahead. This keeping things at arm's length, and I'm not talking about dirty deals. I'm talking about we need you integrated with us in very robust ways as we start looking at how do we move ahead. because we can't afford to duplicate this, and the federal government doesn't have the money to do what we've said we're going to do. We need to help you find the money to do what you need to do for us and for the country. One of the first things we did was say, well, we're going to we'll formulate our projects using the historical rate of rise. And this is the process we used we began developing in the 90s. We'll formulate the way we've always formulated, using historical rate of rise, but then we'll look at how sensitive that design is to one of the second or the third curves. And so if we were to build based on the historical rate and we got the second curve's sea level rise, what would that do to our project? And so we were just looking at sensitivity. And now we're in areas where we don't expect sea level rise to be a great influencer. Then we'll still formulate for an expected level of rise or a consequential, and I'll come back to that in a minute, rise, and then see, well, what happens if it's different. The real need, though, is to go to a matrix, because we need to be looking at all the alternatives with all of the sea level rise scenarios, and in both with project condition and without project condition. So it's a pretty big matrix that we need to be looking at. We're just wading into this business of how do you take a multiple scenario approach to plan formulation. Historically, we've said, all right, here's a future condition based on if things keep happening the way they're happening, this is how bad it's going to be, and this is what we can then justify building a project to do. We can't do that. We got to look at multiple scenarios because nobody can say what the scenarios are going to be. I realize that's kind of glossed over what a lot of my colleagues have invested years in developing, and I don't mean to slight their work, but that's not the problem. One of the things that that's really helped, the conclusion that I've come to in developing the talk for today is we've got this thing engineered, okay? That's not the problem. And we probably can do a planning job that can stand the test of criticism. What we don't know how to do is get something built anymore, okay? Because we have a bigger problem in this country. And I can say this emphatically, we're not going to go in and fix a piece of infrastructure for future sea level rise conditions just for the purpose of accounting for future sea level rise. There is no money to do that, and people talking about that are blowing smoke. What we have to be looking at and here's the challenge within the Corps, as we reinvest in the delivery of water resources services to the economy and the environment of this country, we need to be looking at a broader range of possible scenarios and incorporate that into not just rehabbing projects, but replacing projects. And we spend a lot of time complaining and whining about our crumbling infrastructure, and it's not selling, okay? People don't want to hear how bad your concrete seawall is falling apart, okay? They want to know what service or what new service could you deliver with an improved replacement to a given project. And so we can't just look at, well, it was important in the past, so you need to pay for fixing it. We need to be re-looking at what are the fleet of water resources services that we're going to be needing? How do we modify the existing or build new instruments within that service provision? And then how do we accommodate future change into that process? And oh, by the way, sea level rise is not the only thing. It's just one of the things. It's only one aspect of climate change that we need to be looking at, but there are also other changes besides climate change, and urbanization, population growth. All of those things are putting demands on our systems, and we need to be recognizing that and thinking about how do we deliver the needs of civil society into the future. And so now I'm going to use my phrase, okay, and the challenge here for us civil engineers is we've got to put the civil back in civil engineering, okay? We're providing a fleet of services to the society. We need to be out there talking with them and stop going through the political filter of what gets said, okay? We need to be talking honestly, frankly, about what the needs are, what society wants, and how can we deliver it to them. And we lose a lot when we take the engineering message and filter it through the political process, because politicians are making very short-term decisions, and I'm not criticizing them, but let's be realistic. A representative that's standing for re-election in 2 years, or a president standing for election in 4 years, or even a senator that only has to go for election every 6 years. Those folks don't make long-term decisions, okay? We don't let them make long-term decisions. We force them to make short-term decisions, okay? And let me just say another thing here about, in case you think I'm criticizing our elected representatives. I've been around a number of them. Some of them I've observed closely, some I've observed from far, but I'll say this. Every single one of them is representative of, i.e. looks like, talks like, does like we do, the people who elected them. And if you don't like what they look like, go look in a mirror, okay? And let's stop blaming them for looking like us, okay? Let's accept the fact that they're taking what they're hearing us say and they're putting it into action. And we also need to stay away, we need to stop this, oh, I'm not going to get involved, okay? If you don't get involved, there's no chance they're going to hear the right thing. The sea level is changing. I won't say global sea level changes going on, although we talk about that in our guidance. But there are certainly some large-scale sea level changes going on, and we need to be aware of those. But the thing that we're finding, and of course you folks are living this here, is that the land is moving a whole lot more than any of us ever conceived of. And satellite altimetry has really opened that view up, okay? And we paid NRC to do a study of sea level change on the West Coast a couple of years ago. Really did a remarkable job of looking at the subject. And if there's anything you want to look at, it's that report. Not because it has anything directly applicable here, but that group of guys and gals really did a good job of looking at all the things that affect what the level of the water is with respect to the land. And they point out that at least on the West Coast, and I think probably elsewhere as well, but certainly on the West Coast, you don't have to go more than a kilometer or two before the land surface has changed in one direction in one place, and 2 miles away it's going in the opposite direction. Okay, this Earth surface is modifying itself a whole lot more than any of us ever conceived. And obviously subsidence is, and regional subsidence is a significant action, but that's not the only thing. We need to be becoming more and more aware of what the land is doing, and we need to be looking not just at what the average sea level is doing over a 30-year period of time, but what are the highs and lows doing, okay? The interesting thing in San Francisco Bay, for example, the average sea level rise is at a rate that's pretty close to what the historical is. But if you look at what the extremes are, how high the high tides are and how low the low tides are, you see that the range of tidal motion is a whole lot greater than it's been in the past. So there's a lot more water moving in and out. So don't just be focused on that average mean sea level. As a matter of fact, I would say that's probably the last thing we need to be focused on. Now, somebody will probably shoot me for that, but we need to be looking at the extreme water levels. And Courtney Hackney, a biology professor now at University of North Florida, has looked at salt marshes and how high does the sea level have to get before a salt marsh changes in character. And it's only an increase of 3 or 4 excursions of salt water into that marsh before things start changing radically. So if we're waiting for sea level rise to get, this thing's already going to be wiped out, because the extreme events that come along, the storms that come along, are going to change the character of that marsh a whole lot sooner than average sea level is. The other thing that we've got to be looking at, and the Pacific once again gives us a good place to look at how all of these things tie together. Several years ago we had the opportunity to bring the people that study waves and the people that study winds and storms and the people that study water levels to get in the same room. And one of the things we found out was they really didn't know each other and they don't talk to each other, but they absolutely need to be talking to each other. So let's talk to the oceanography folks and meteorology. Okay, you need to be having some sessions where the waves people talk to the water level people, talk to the storm people, the meteorological people. We got to see how all of this stuff fits together. So what's going on in the Pacific Ocean? There is significant sea level rise in the western part of the Pacific Ocean basin over against the Asian coast. And how did that happen? Well, the water got warmer, and as the water got warmer, it expanded. As the water got warmer, the trade winds increased. And as the trade winds increased, it blew more of that warmer water over against the Asian coast. How did we find that out? Well, early in the 2000s, we were going to invest in the place we could study inundation around deep water islands, i.e. ones without a continental shelf. The best place in the U.S. territories was Guam. They had a typhoon every year and a super typhoon every 3 years. The Weather Service guaranteed you go there and you're going to get it hit and you're going to be able to study water level excursions up and down the coast, and you'll have an answer in 3 to 5 years. We had a transect of gauges and actually 2 transects and other data there for over 10 years. We got one typhoon within 200 miles and no direct hits. Well, why was that? Because all of the typhoons were following the warmer water and going across at the equator and then up on the backside of Guam and never getting to Guam. But that's a significant result. And if you don't think storms are getting more intense, just talk to the Philippine ambassador. Okay, they just got wiped out by the strongest hurricane typhoon on record, Yolanda. Horrible event. But why? Because all that warmer water's over against that Asian coast. And so we should expect more of that to occur. Now, one of the other things that some scientists are concerned, well, what happens if it builds up too much on the Asian coast and then starts sloshing back? What could happen on the U.S. coast? And that's a real big hypothetical, but it's a question we need to be looking at. But what else has happened in the Pacific? Normally, atmospheric pressure is lowest over the equator and higher over the Aleutians. But the last 20 years or so, we've had the opposite circumstance. Pressures are lower over the Aleutians and higher over the equator. So the storms, instead of coming out of the South Pacific going northward along our coast, they're coming out of the Aleutians going southward. And who most needs to be concerned about that? Well, a coastal engineer does, because he's worried about which direction the sand is going to move. And so if you have a major shift in which direction the waves are coming from, guess what? You're going to have a major shift in which way the sand is being transported. Okay, and we need to be looking at those kinds of big picture things. And that's where coastal engineers really need to be digging into this with the waves people and the storms people. What's the other effect of that, though? Is not only are there more storms in the Aleutians, then they're tracking across the northern latitudes of the United States and then hitting the Atlantic coast, and we're getting more nor'easters. Now, but believe me, there's statisticians everywhere who will argue any point you want to make. And so somebody will shoot at me for this and say, oh no, you can't find it in the record that we're having an increase. You need to be engaged in that debate, okay? And this then brings us into the subject of stationary versus non-stationarity. I don't know if you're engaged, or any of you are engaged in that debate, but you need to be. Now, I'll get a little bit controversial. The folks that believe in stationarity say, well, nothing's changing. It's just a matter of collecting enough data, and we'll be able to state what your 100-year event is and your 500-year event is. And so just trust us. We'll extrapolate this straight line and tell you what your event is. But except that we've known for 20 years that doesn't work. Okay? Why, after every major storm, does FEMA come in and recalculate the flood insurance rate maps? And I'm not talking about adjusting them by a foot or two, but I'm talking about adjusting them by 10 feet or so. And we found that out when we visited southern Mississippi right after FEMA had released their post-Katrina maps. And those boys were just getting their new insurance bills, and they weren't real happy. So let me just say this to the people who deal with probabilistic science. There's something fatally flawed about how we do probabilities. And yes, I know we need more data, and the data record isn't long enough for us to make a more confident statement. In which case, then I think we need to back up and stop making the statements. We're losing credibility here by sticking with this concept of stationarity. And in fact, if if you're a believer in climate change, then by definition, you have to be throwing out the probabilistic approach, because the fundamental assumption is that nothing's changing. And in fact, not only does climate change demand that we accept that things are changing, the data is showing, I think, pretty interestingly, that things are changing. Let me just say this. We really need you folks to weigh in on that. And I'm not saying everybody needs to convert to a probabilistic scientist, but somebody needs to be calling them to task and then working with them. Don't just throw stones, but go sit down and let's figure this out. I can say this, not because I'm speaking for the Chief of Engineers here or Chief of Engineering, but I have a hard time talking to people when I know we're not giving them credible information. And the fact that FEMA has to recalculate flood insurance rate maps and change them radically after a major storm says there's something fatally flawed. And I can't solve it, but you folks have a chance at it. Okay, and you did mention the word Sandy in there, now, so I guess I better talk a little bit about Sandy and what does it mean. Because I don't want you to feel you've been shortchanged. Sandy was a huge event. And what was particularly unique, I think a lot of people grasped that it was the merging of a tropical system, Hurricane Sandy, with an extratropical system that moved over from the Aleutians, and it combined into one mammoth 1,000-mile wide storm. And so everybody says, oh, this is so unique. Except this was the third time it's happened in 20 years, where a tropical event combined with an extratropical event and created a significant event. Okay, the first one was the perfect storm in 1992. The second one was the Nor-Ida, that wasn't a big surge event, but was a heck of a beach erosion event. And then the third was Sandy, okay? And the Weather Service is grasping that this segmenting of the tropical into one part of the world and keeping those people isolated from the people who do the forecasting for the extratropical events, that's got to end. And at some point you'll see how they merge. But we've taken way too simple approach to categorizing weather events, and it's horribly complicated. What's the biggest downfall in storm surge modeling? It isn't the physics of the storm surge model, and it isn't the grid size or grid configuration of the storm surge models. It's the wind fields we plug into them, okay? Because we don't know what they're going to be, and they're highly variable, and we just take these idealized wind fields for a hurricane, plop them into a storm surge model, and say, look how great we are. Except that what's the real problem? It's the winds, okay? Folks, we need good wind data, okay? And the storm surge modelers need to become more demanding of the meteorologist. We've got to find a way to crack that nut. Interestingly, going back to the Pacific, who was one of the first people to tell us, hey, we got a problem here. We got way too many storms hitting Hawaii, the north shore of Oahu. And how did they know? Well, they have a large homeless population in Hawaii, and most of these people live literally on the beaches. And so it was the emergency managers that came to us and said, hey, something's happening out here. We're getting 3 or 4 times as many high wave events, non-storm events, but distant storms coming in, killing people, hundreds, on our beaches, because we got no way to predict when the large waves are going to get here. And so we have all of these storms up in the Aleutians. Nobody's tracking where the waves are going from them. We don't have a system of gauges out or buoys out there to really track when are these things coming. So it's the emergency management community saying, look, we need to get a better handle on where are the storm waves coming from that travel the long distances, and when are they going to get here? So I detracted away from Sandy once again. The Corps of Engineers got $5 billion and very specific directions of what to spend that on. And we are running as fast as we can to build the projects that we got funding for, and we got a modest amount of money to do some further studies. Okay, you know what? Here's the kind of money we got. We got money to take and restore all of the projects that were already on the ground, the beach nourishment projects, restore them to design conditions, not just pre-storm conditions, but to design conditions with Sandy money. We got money, and that's 100% federal money, okay? No cost sharing required on that recharge the beaches. We also had a fleet of projects that had been authorized but had never received initial construction money from Congress. So we got the initial construction money from Congress for a fleet of, I think, another 8 projects. Okay, so we're moving ahead with those to build to design conditions. We also got a pot of money to take any feasibility study that was underway and speed up the completion of that feasibility study at 100% federal expense. And then it gives us the authority to then move directly into construction, i.e. these projects are authorized if the Assistant Secretary of the Army signs off and says, these meet all the criteria and we can move to construction. We don't have to go back to Congress and get a separate authorization on those. Pretty unique set of authorities that we've gotten there. We've also been given within that, seemingly, the authority to look at the latest science and incorporate what the latest science, i.e. sea level rise and storminess and any other scientific information, and modify the design for these projects to incorporate the latest science. Now, that hadn't happened yet, okay? We've had a meeting and we've looked at that subject somewhat, but that's not going anywhere soon. And people within the Corps and within the administration would give you a variety of reasons about, or excuses of why we can't. But Congress clearly had the intent of, all right, let's don't just put it back the way it was. Let's look at what it needs to be and start putting it back that way. One of the reasons that it didn't happen was the approval process for changing a project that markedly, OMB would have demanded a chance to relook at the economics of it, and we haven't wanted to push that ahead. we want to get the beaches rebuilt. We'll see about what they need to be into the future, But that begins to get us to some of the bigger problems. And so I described how the Corps incorporates sea level rise into our planning process, and there are equivalents for the design guidance. But the challenge here is that the planning process is just too cumbersome. That's a nice way of putting it. And General Walsh, when he came in as commander for Civil Works, said we got to change that. The problem with the change that he's tried to make, which is constrain us, you got to have a planning study done inside 3 years, or you're not going to get any more money. The problem with that is then we take the really big studies and break them into pieces that can be done in 3 years, and so it abandons our systems approach to things. So we got to be looking at that a little bit more closely. But he's correct in that our planning process is just way too slow, and there's way too much process in the planning process. So we have, we have a rational view of how we ought to be planning things, and how we ought to be investing in water resources infrastructure. The place where we've fallen apart is in the constructing and the appropriating construction money for construction. And the real lesson learned out of Katrina was not the physical forensics study, but the decision making forensic study that said, all right, we had a system of coastal protection around New Orleans that was formulated as a system of protection, and it was designed as a system of protection, authorized by Congress as a system of protection. And then when we went to construct it, we made one decision at a time each year, okay? And each year we would say, well, this is what I can do. Or the local government said, this is as much as we can invest from our side. And we started nickel and diming that construction effort to death, okay? So we never built the complete system the way the system was designed, and then furthermore, we didn't keep up with the changes that were occurring. We knew the levees were settling, but we hadn't finished initial construction someplace else, so we said we can't leave them unprotected. We can't go back and reestablish the level of protection here when we haven't even done the initial protection someplace else. And so 30 years into it, then we get caught not having a completely integrated, constructed system, and that was at least part of the problem. Now, not saying that there weren't design flaws, because there were at least two very serious design flaws. One of them was geotechnical. We didn't look at deflection of the eye walls that were planted in the levees. But we had identified that as a failure, but once again couldn't go back and start fixing the eye walls because we still hadn't finished the rest of the system. The other thing that we did, and now I'm going to shoot at the coastal engineers. Wave height is the most important parameter that we need to design coastal structures, but it's not the only one. And the problem in Katrina in terms of a coastal engineering design was not that we missed on what the wave height was going to be, but what the wavelength could be. And so we were looking at wave periods. Well, let's say a 6 or 8 second wave is probably the most we considered, and we got a 16-second wave. And a 16-second wave really just sloshes. And why did the levee fail there on the Mr. Go, Mississippi River Gulf Outlet? Because those long period waves just sloshed right over the levees, okay? We can go back to the Pacific and look at 3 or 4 other places where we've blown the design because we didn't get the wavelength right, okay? If there's anything I can say to the coastal engineering community is help us get real about wavelength design. That's a serious need, and we're not working on it. So help us. But then the other problem with how we fund projects is that we're out of money, okay? Uncle Sugar doesn't have any more money. We can barely, we're not even coming close to building the portfolio of authorized projects that we have. And in fact, we are, and the Sandy experience put us back into this mode even more so, okay? So you can't get enough money to build your projects or to maintain your projects or to re-nourish your projects through the annual appropriations process, so you hope for your disaster, okay? So what you need, if you want to fix things down here, you got to hope you get your Sandy real soon, devastate the region, and the federal government will jump in, create new money, put it in an emergency supplemental, and fix the problem. No, you can go to any number of jetty projects around the country that are way past 50-year economic life, way past 100-year physical life, deteriorating significantly, and we can't get them repaired, let alone rehabbed. So what are we doing? We're waiting for a major storm to just wipe them out, and then we'll get the money to go back in and do it. And I'm not just pointing at Congress, because Congress is a reflection of the people that they represent. We got to look seriously at where we're investing money. And I think that leads us to, we got to get into a new paradigm on how we finance public infrastructure, okay? And it's got to get out of the federal appropriations process. The politics of that are killing us. Now, and I say that, and I think I can get away with saying this, is because when Congress makes a decision about what to invest in terms of at least water resources infrastructure, it's a bipartisan decision. There is not conflict between Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives on investing in public infrastructure in the Corps. The problem is a bigger one. How much are we going to put into this business? And that's very much a constitutional argument. And it doesn't, again, matter whether or not it's a Republican Congress or a split Congress and a president of the same party or the opposite party. They don't agree. And they haven't agreed. And I would say that the times where we actually got the best circumstances were when we had a president from one party and a Congress, both houses, from the opposite party, okay? Where did they really make good, tough decisions and move ahead? When Reagan was president and he had a Democratic Congress, and when Clinton was president and he had a Republican Congress. They worked things out. The worst cases are when we've had a Republican president and a Republican Congress and a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, man, it just really falls apart there. But even if we could assure that we were all going to always have a difference there, there isn't enough money within the federal appropriations process to make the kind of investments. We get $5 billion a year plus or minus. And the FY14 appropriations that was just passed was the highest annual appropriations we've ever gotten for civil works. But we need to be investing $40 to $50 billion a year in water resources infrastructure in this country. We've got a $60 billion backlog of authorized projects we haven't started building, let alone the needs that keep developing. And while in the Corps we keep focusing on the two big dogs of the past, flood control and navigation, the freight train that's coming at us in this country is water supply. Now, we don't handle the direct sale of water, but we do provide storage. So we're the general suppliers of water in many instances. And as the Midwest and Texas experience more and more droughts and more frequently, and California is beginning to experience them, the shift is going to have to occur, and somebody's going to have to make some tough decisions about water supply. And I think water supply will become the dominating feature of our inland water resources infrastructure. Now, is that going to happen easily, quickly? No. The flood control people and the navigation people are going to fight that tooth and nail. But we as a people are going to be running out of water in certain places. Not everywhere. I'm not trying to say the sky is falling, but I am saying there's a freight train coming at us. We got to start looking differently. So my time is about up. We are looking at how do we finance these things differently. How do we acquire private financing for public infrastructure and then create a way to give a return on investment to those private investors? And you say, well, who would do that? Pension funds, okay? And they've already come to us and say, hey, can we invest in public infrastructure? Why? Because we provide them a constant, steady rate of return. They're not looking for 20%, they're looking for a good 9 or 10%. And public infrastructure is a way to do that. Does that require we retool how we finance things? Absolutely. We're going to have to pass some new laws? Absolutely. But there isn't any money someplace else to do it. We've got to start getting the private money to invest in these things. And the governance structure, one of my colleagues is this week over visiting in the Netherlands with the folks at the Delta Commission who manage the flow of money there. What have they done? As a result of seeing the failure of Katrina, what did the Dutch do? They went back and said, oh, if this happened here, we could be in real trouble. So they've taken their financing of public waterworks out of the annual appropriations process. They've created a commissioner who has the responsibility for building a fleet, and there's some specificity to what he's supposed to be accomplishing, but it's general, not we're approving this design, we're authorizing this little project here. It's here's the way ahead. Here's €1 billion a year to do this for the next 4 years. Come back and report to us on how successful you are. But all the day-to-day decisions are out of the political realm. We've got to have some kind of a mixture here of a different management process and a different financing process. We are having the discussions. We're looking at that right now. You folks are going to have to become part of that as well. Okay, we got to create a new system. How many parts are working together, many parts of society, sectors of society are actively engaged in day-to-day things, not just reviewing a feasibility study when we let you look at it. So with that, I'll ask for questions.
John Whitelaw here. When you were talking about the pension funds investing in infrastructure and them getting a 9–10% rate of return, I don't understand what the revenue stream is. Where does the 9 or 10% come from?
Well, we would have to create a new revenue stream back to them. Okay, that's part of what we've got to work on. That part we haven't answered, but we've got to find a way to do that. But what happens right now? If there are revenues from a project, and not just Corps, but Bureau of Reclamation and National Park Service, where does the revenue that they bring in? And we bring it in from hydropower, from water supply, from our recreation at reservoirs. That money goes directly into the federal treasury, and then Congress doesn't even know what, they don't even look at what kind of revenue are we producing by our products. They just take it in and give us much less than we did. This would be like a private company taking all of their revenues, turning their revenues over to the shareholders, and not having even operating expenses, except for what they can beg back, okay? That's the part of this we've got to change.
I think it's a very difficult process in society to change this, that we, in many areas, take a view where we put on the seatbelt after the accident. It looks that many of the things we do today in handling the natural disasters is actually comparable to the seatbelt, because it's a low probability event, a car accident, so why should I put on a seatbelt? I can do this after the accident. And it's also the problem with the stationarity. When we look at the data, and you emphasize the importance of data, the data that we have about the Holocene and about the present is telling us that we are leaving the Holocene, and that is a highly non-stationary process. So for me, the question is, what would you recommend? How can we make the transition in our society to be more precautionary and to really think about the medium probability, not even the low probability, medium impact events a little bit more, and then maybe even take into account the low probability, high impact events?
The short-term solution is, while you guys, you smart guys, are working on the probabilities and answering that question, because we're not going to answer the question you are. What we aren't doing anyway, no matter how we estimate the probabilities, is we underplay the consequence side of the equation. Okay, risk is a product of the probability of event times the consequence of an event. Okay, and yeah, we say we're looking at benefits, but we certainly don't characterize it as what are the consequences of something happening. And I guarantee you, the thing that we don't ever talk about is, and what's the consequence is if this isn't enough protection. Okay, we really got to start looking at what are the consequences. And let me just say that we don't have to solve this all over the country, but I think we have a very compelling case of why we need to do it in the New York City area, in the New Orleans area, Houston, Galveston, Norfolk, and LA, Long Beach, okay? Let's just take those 5 areas. Those are the areas that if there was something major happen, it would have major ramifications on the economy across the country. And I don't think we have, we shouldn't be nickel and diming the protection we provide in New York City. And let me tell you, it's not happening yet, okay, post-Katrina. We need to be retooling protection in lower Manhattan, the transportation system in all of the New York metro area, and the power grid in the Northeast. Okay? And you don't do it piecemeal. You do it in conjunction with each other and sequencing things in a way that makes sense as you're doing it. Okay? You just take those 5 regions that I just named and let's start looking at the consequences and accepting we can't afford to have a failure of any kind here. Okay? Let me just explain how we make decisions in Washington. It is not based upon a level of protection. As a matter of fact, the level of protection, it turns out, for our shore protection projects on Long Island and mid-Atlantic is about a 30 or 40-year event. Why? Because we don't design to a level of protection. We don't even come close to designing to a 100-year event, and I wouldn't call a 100-year event an extreme event. But we don't even come close to that. Why? Because the metric that is used in actually making a decision is maximizing the net benefit. So we look at an alternative, a series of alternatives. The alternative that produces the most benefit at the least cost, or so that B minus C is the maximum number, that's how we decide things, okay? But in doing so, we don't look at all the consequences, okay? We don't look at the consequences to how society functions and how the economy functions. We're beginning to calculate those numbers, but unfortunately the decisions are still made on this B minus C, and the result of B minus C in the mid-Atlantic is we end up building a 30-year event, building for a 30-year event. That's not dealing with consequences. Now, and Long Island makes a good range, okay? How we respond to things in Manhattan should be radically different from how we respond to things in Montauk, okay? So we got a range there. So let's develop our protection that is scaled on the basis of consequence. And in the meantime, then you smart folks can come up with a better way of predicting what the probabilities are, and then we can start fixing the calculation of risk. But with that, I think also then comes, we got to deal with the uncertainty issue.
As the moderator, I got a question.
Okay.
The report says that this is the policy we're following up till, I think, September of 2013. So my question is, Charlie, what's happening in the meantime in terms of how is that policy being studied, or what's the latest on that policy? Because that essentially, a lot of people watch that and they see what the Corps is doing, so that's very important.
Okay. That engineer circular, which is a temporary set of guidance, but this will be the 3rd time we've redone it, was just signed. The new guidance was just signed this week. I didn't see it, but I saw that it was signed. It probably made some further advancements and looked at the IPCC data, probably did more to incorporate IPCC numbers in with the NRC numbers. The other thing that's coming in is NOAA's got an upper limit that we are becoming more sensitive to, that's based upon a catastrophic failure of the ice sheets in either Greenland or Antarctica. So we're aware of that. It's not a matter of are we accepting those other numbers or are we not. We're looking at scenarios, so anyway, the guidance keeps getting improved or updated, And I think we've got, and we're working on revising the regulation, which is the longer term permanent set of guidance. And I know that that's in the works, but I don't know where it is. We also have an engineering technical letter that's very close to being signed that gives a lot more guidance on how to do what's in the guidance.
Well, okay, and so what you said before, and that is we have to essentially anticipate that we're not going to know the range very well. And as you said, the consequences, we have to really design for failure. And we have to look at the strong possibility that whatever we do, the consequences might fail. And whatever that means, we might have to put in redundancy, might have to have a secondary line of defense, such as down in Louisiana, where a lot of things can be done if we all of a sudden wake up to the fact that we can't predict those accelerating curves very well. Our probability curves are not stationary. I like that. That makes a lot of sense. And that we have to just simply recognize that failure is reality. And that's, if we finally come to grasp of that, I think we can move on. Yeah. So with that, I want to thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.